There's an old joke about Unitarian Universalists that goes like this. So a Unitarian Universalist dies at a ripe old age, and the moment after passing on, she finds herself floating up through the sky, wings and all, leaving her body below. She goes, I guess there is an afterlife after all. And after she floats up past the top layer of clouds, she finds her spirit body, or whatever it is, deposited on this sort of luminous road heading off into the starry distance. So she sets off to follow the road, and presently she comes to a fork. There's a signpost at the fork in the road. And there's one arrow pointing off to the left fork of the road with a signpost underneath it that says, "This way to heaven." And there's another arrow pointing to the right fork, and the sign underneath it says, "This way to discussion of heaven." So, of course, being a good UU, she happily takes the right fork. Right, we come from a thinky tradition, we Unitarian Universalists. We come from a disputatious tradition, a tradition that likes to argue about things and discuss things. After all, we are the offspring of not one, but two separate heretical movements in Christianity. Movements that grew out of arguments. This is our heritage. And we come out of a particularly bookish form of Protestantism, called Puritanism. And our Puritan forebears were positively obsessed with scripture and language and words and arguing about words. And the Unitarian heresy and the Universalist heresy originally arose out of Christians very closely and carefully reading the scripture, trying to parse out the meaning therein, applying the spirit of critical reason that was all the rage then. And they found out that, in their conclusion, the Trinity was nowhere to be found in the Bible, giving us Unitarians, and eternal damnation was nowhere to be found in the Bible, giving us Universalists. And for that, they were kicked out of mainstream Christianity forever, because they had wrong beliefs. So, the freedom of conscience that became central to the practice of Unitarianism and Universalism was understood to mean freedom of belief, freedom to have your own doctrine. Our historical rejection of imposed creeds meant we insisted on the freedom to find our own words for our beliefs and not to have to mouth anyone else's words or formulas in order to hold membership in one of our churches. Now, this month, we've been talking about our fourth principle that affirms for each Unitarian Universalist a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And because of our history, we tend to conceive of the truth and meaning we are searching for in terms of beliefs. The free search for truth and meaning means we are free to come up with our very own groupings of sentences expressing in our own words our own thoughts about the existence or non-existence of God, or afterlife, or reincarnation, or the nature of good and evil, or what have you. So our search for truth and meaning then can be a very sort of intellectual, thinky project, and a very wordy project. We are the people that are famously sensitive about language. I was recently handed a bunch of old sort of denominational newsletters from the 80s to read through, and these were mostly ministers reporting back and forth to each other what was going on in their own congregations. And at the time, they were reporting a lot of heated arguments over whether or not the sermons were going to be called sermons or talks. And there was a lot of blood spilled over that one, metaphorically speaking. At least I hope, metaphorically speaking. So I'm not really making light of this. The freedom to find our own truth is central to Unitarian Universalism. It is one of the great things about our way of doing religion. But I sometimes wonder if our historical emphasis on doctrinal freedom and our Protestant emphasis on the importance of having correct belief skews the way we think about what a search for truth and meaning is, what it's about, what is the desired end product of our search for truth and meaning. Is it to obtain right ideas? Does the search end, if it were ever to come to an end, in an intellectualization, right? A series of hopefully correct sentences that we hold in our brain as as sort of a final personal credo that we've gotten right and now we can die. Is the goal to become, in the end, personally correct about this whole universe thing? So for a different perspective about what a search for truth and meaning might look like, I want to share with you a story from the Zen Buddhist tradition, my current favorite Zen story. So a man is enjoying a casual stroll through the jungle when he hears a noise behind him, and he turns around to see a fierce Bengal tiger bursting out onto the path several hundred yards behind him. And surprised and terrified, he takes off running down the path, but the tiger turns and sees him and takes off after him. So he's running, and the tiger is chasing, and suddenly the path ends at a cliff, and the tiger's still behind him, but he sees that there's a vine going over the cliff. So he grabs onto it and climbs down. And the tiger, meanwhile, reaches the top of the cliff and is sort of pacing back and forth, hungrily licking its chops. So the man pauses midway down the cliff, hanging onto the vine, and he looks down to see how far he has to go. And he sees below him there is another tiger, pacing back and forth at the base of the cliff, also hungrily licking its chops. So he's hanging there, mulling over his predicament, and out of a little hole in the cliff, two mice come out, and they crawl onto the vine, and they begin gnawing the vine. He tries to shoo them away, but they won't go. So he looks at the tiger, and he looks at the tiger, and he looks at the mice, and then he notices out of the corner of his eye, growing on the face of the cliff, a wild strawberry bush. So he reaches over, and he picks the strawberry, and he eats it, and a smile breaks out on his face, and he says, "Delicious." So, we can think of the tigers in a couple of different ways. As the regrets about our past and the worries about our future, or the tiger above is the problems of life chasing us, and the tiger below is the inevitable and final solution to those problems that is waiting for all of us one day or another. But the point is that suspended between the unchangeable past and the inevitable future, he finds meaningful action in the present moment by being mindful to the experience that is available to him. He could be so consumed with worry that he doesn't even notice the strawberry. I mean, it has nothing to do with the problem that he's facing. He could be so full of fear that he can't even taste the strawberry in his mouth, let alone pluck it with his trembling hands. But having chosen to eat the strawberry, he eats the strawberry with his full attention, and so he takes full joy and pleasure and meaning in the experience. So this year, we've been talking about our 7 principles, and in particular, it's been sort of organized around different virtues that might help us in living or actualizing these principles. And I had 3 virtues in mind originally related to our search for truth and meaning. Not that these are the only related virtues, but just ones that in particular I wanted to hold up. And the first was supposed to be the virtue of intellectual humility, but we got called on account of weather, so what are you going to do? Get a pass on that. The second virtue, which we talked about in our postmodern service, was the virtue of carefully listening to the truths of others. And the third virtue I'd like to call attentiveness, or mindfulness, or being present in the moment. And I wanted to devote an entire sermon to this topic because we UUs can be kind of a thinky bunch, and we get off in our heads, and we're dreamers, so we're chasing after some abstract idea or some distant vision. But life is always happening right now. I'm probably guiltier of this than most people, especially as a young person. I was sort of forever living my life in my head. And a million years ago when I was an art student, I remember I used to walk to class every day with a friend of mine, and one particularly fine spring day, he pointed out this cherry tree that was in front of the building and how beautiful it was. And taking a moment to marvel at its delicate blossoms, I said, "I've never even noticed that before." And he laughed and he said, "We walk by that tree every single day." He said, "If you want to be a visual artist, you're probably going to want to start looking at things." Well, I didn't end up being an artist, but I do try to look at things. The Vietnamese Zen Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh talks about what he calls mindful living. In his short introduction to Zen practice, a book called The Miracle of Mindfulness, he writes, "There are two ways to wash the dishes. The first is to wash the dishes in order to have clean dishes, and the second is to wash the dishes to wash the dishes." He continues, "If while washing dishes we think only of the cup of tea that awaits us, thus hurrying to get the dishes out of the way as if they were a nuisance, then we are not washing the dishes to wash the dishes. In fact, we are what's more, we are not alive during the time we are washing the dishes. In fact, we are completely incapable of realizing the miracle of life while standing at the sink. And if we can't wash the dishes, the chances are we won't be able to drink our tea either. While drinking the cup of tea, we will only be thinking of other things, barely aware of the cup in our hands. Thus, we are sucked away into the future, and we are incapable of actually living 1 minute of life." Thich Nhat Hanh says, "We should wash each pot and pan with the same loving care and attentiveness as though we were washing the baby Jesus, or the baby Buddha." The principle of mindfulness is the antidote to our harried, multitasking lives, where we grab our food on the way out the door, we gulp it down while fighting traffic on the way into work, checking our email and Facebook at every traffic light, and then the meal is over and we are hardly even conscious of having eaten it. We have hardly experienced our own life as we lived it. Han would say, slow down, stop rushing, stop multitasking. Wherever you are, be there. Whatever you are doing, do that thing. When you drink your coffee, drink your coffee. Feel your hands on the mug. Pay attention to the sensation of your fingers, the warmth of the surface, the texture of the dish. Smell and taste the beverage itself. Feel how your body feels as you are sitting or standing. Feel your breath as it enters and leaves your body. Inhabit the moments of your own experience. One day, watching a friend hurriedly gobble down a tangerine, noticing that the man was barely swallowing one piece before sort of popping the other one into his mouth, Han said, "A tangerine has sections. If you can eat just one section, you can probably eat the entire tangerine. But if you can't eat a single section, you cannot eat the tangerine." And so with life. Our life is lived in the present moment as it arrives. If we do not live each moment, then we do not live a whole. If we are not mindful of the moment we have, Han would say, then we will have lived without living. However, if we honor each moment of our lives with our full attention, our full mind and heart and spirit, then we can experience great joy in the simple fact of our everyday lives. Han places the mindfulness at the center of his Zen Buddhist practice. If you're interested in trying it out, he includes many practical exercises in his book for developing mindfulness through meditation, and then for how to extend that practice out into your everyday life so that we're mindful while walking about, while talking to friends, working, eating our meals, drinking our coffee, and yes, mindful while washing our dishes. Now, one thing that I particularly liked about Han's approach is that he's actually very grounded and practical. He seems to take his Buddhism with a liberal admixture of Aristotle, who said everything in moderation. Han knows that we have jobs and we have responsibilities, and we cannot spend every moment of our life devoted to trying to be mindful of what we are doing now, because we have bosses and things like that. He suggests that we take one day out of the week and devote it to practicing mindfulness. And it is a practice, it's something you learn, like practicing the piano. He suggests taking one day out of the week and devoting it to mindful living as a sort of Zen Sabbath. And the practice is intended to be restorative, to refresh the spirit. Now, Han had a very practical reason for recommending this. At the time, he was mentoring a group of young Buddhist peace workers in Vietnam, and this was during the Vietnam War. And these students were attempting to take neither side, but to minister equally to all parties. And as such, they were exposed to a lot of violence, and they were trying to do their work under conditions of extreme stress. And in order for them to be effective, they needed some means of managing that stress, and they needed some way of lifting their spirits back up after each failure or each new struggle. And so the practice of mindfulness became a tool for social justice work, part of what Han calls engaged Buddhism. Now today, according to the book Buddhist Voices in Unitarian Universalism, there are a fairly small number of UUs who identify as both UU and Buddhist, less than 10%. But there is a larger proportion of our members whose spiritual practice has been enriched or informed by Buddhist practices, like mindfulness. But there are also two sort of specifically Unitarian Universalist contexts in which I wanted to talk about the virtue of being present today. So the first is in being present to the pain of the world. As a religious tradition with centuries of commitment to social justice work, it is part of our work as Unitarian Universalists to bear witness to injustice, to call it out, to hold up the suffering of the world and the inhumanity of person to person and say, this will not stand. As such, we have to be willing to sit with the pain we see around us, to be fully present to it. Many of us drive by homeless people every day, right? It's just a thing. It's a sad part of the urban landscape. We see a person standing in the cold, we feel whatever momentary feeling we feel about it, and then we arrive at our destination and get on with our lives because what else are you going to do? But we are tasked as a religious people with seeing their faces when we see them, with being present to their humanity, and with carrying the awareness of their suffering with us throughout our day. To stand in solidarity with people who suffer means to be present to their pain, so that it becomes, to some extent, our own pain. To say, there is a person in need, there is a person who is suffering, is just to state a fact. But if we are fully present to that suffering, if we achieve solidarity with that suffering, even to a small extent, then that mere fact becomes a truth, and that truth becomes part of the meaning of our lives. Now, this is a hard teaching. This is not the fun part of our religious tradition. We didn't create the pain in the world. We have no power to wave a magic wand and make it better. And we will not see an end to suffering and injustice and cruelty in our lifetime, or our children's lifetime, or our children's lifetime. But we are committed to the victory of love over hate, and reason over prejudice, and compassion over greed and isolation. And so until those things finally come to pass, it will be part of our work to hold up that vision, which means it is part of our work to be present to the pain of the world. I know many people have worked hard on the campaign against H.J.R. 3, the bill that would amend the Indiana Constitution to enshrine marriage and equality. And this has been a hard campaign. A lot of UUs have worked on it. A lot of other people, of course, have worked on it. A lot of our own teenagers have worked on it. And last week we suffered a setback when it looked like maybe victory was in our grasp, and it was a hard blow. And Monday we may see another setback. And I know that a lot of people are hurting, and a lot of people are angry, and a lot of people are wondering how can ignorance and prejudice be winning in our states. So let us take courage. Sit with your pain, be present to it, acknowledge it, feel it. Be present to the injustice that is happening in our state. Feel your solidarity with everyone whose lives are touched by this struggle. And then use that to fuel your work, to take you past the anger and the sadness. Because this fight is not over, and there are many other fights that are not over. So that brings us to the second UU context in which I wanted to talk about the virtue of being present. One of the sources we claim as being a foundation of our religious tradition It's the direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder which moves us to a renewal of the Spirit. This is one of those sources that can be hard sometimes for thinky, talky you use to get our heads around because it's not in our heads. This is the part of how we experience truth and meaning that more properly belongs to the realm of poetry, or art, or music, or metaphor, or symbol. And we all experience it in different ways. Maybe we experience it while gardening, or running, or praying, while looking at a sunset, or watching our children sleep. There's an awesome magic and mystery to life. There's an electricity and heat that runs under the surface of things. There's a long, slow chord that has been resonating since the universe was born, and we are in it, and it is in us, and we need to feel that sometimes. We need to feel our soul's connection, I'm being poetic here, to that larger mystery. No doubt it feels different for each of us when we feel it, but we need it. We need it to be inspired, we need it to be refreshed, we need it to be reminded why we do what we do. And we need it because sometimes we just need it. But we have to be present in order to experience it. The magic and mystery of life doesn't happen in our heads. It doesn't happen in the past or the future. It is happening in the world, in the present moment, right now, all around us. And so we have to be there for it to experience it. We have to be attentive to connect to it. And especially because that first task is so hard, being present to the pain of the world. It is essential that we not neglect the second task, being present to the wonder of the world, because the second task sustains the first. In our reading, Mary Oliver wrote, "At Blackwater Pond, the tossed waters have settled after a night of rain. I dip my cupped hands, I drink a long time. It tastes like stone, leaves, fire. It falls cold into my body, waking the bones. I hear them deep inside me whispering, oh, what is that beautiful thing that just happened?" Beautiful things are happening all around us. Let us be present, fully present to the miracle of life in this moment. Let us never forget to drink deeply from the tossed waters, waking our bones, and then renewed and refreshed, let us do the work we have covenanted here to do. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. May it be so, blessed be. Would you please rise and embody your spirit?